So this morning I want to start partly by picking up on some of the things that we were talking about yesterday, and partly on things that some of you have heard me talking about for a very long time, so apologies for that, but I have to bring some new elements into it today as well. Because yesterday we were talking about things like points of view about how to make assumptions explicit, how to be clear about what we're doing. And as some of you know, this to me is one of the really key questions, in fact, in what we're all doing in some respects. I think we're all describing handwriting, whether that's by statistical methods, whether it's by machine learning and so on, whether it's by verbal descriptions and so forth. And the question to me that keeps coming up over and over and over is this one. Interesting. There we go. Okay, thank you. This one here, how is it possible to proceed in such a way that the description of a specimen of handwriting is as clear and convincing to its reader as it is to its author? We've been asking this for, well, hundreds of years, frankly, and I'm happy to go into more details of that, but unfortunately there's not time today. But so that's the key question, how can we be clear and convincing? It comes back in a sense to something Malcolm mentioned yesterday. He doesn't ask, how can we be right? How can we get the best answer? His question is much more about how can we communicate with each other. And this, I think, is an important theme, again, that came up briefly and can come up again, I hope, this morning. It's a very, very difficult question, though. I think that's probably clear. And part of my talk today is going to be to illustrate why it's so difficult and some of the complications around it. In fact, Lamphard and others have also known this for a long time. This expertise in the context of forensic handwriting, but also describing handwriting in general, is very difficult to verbalize and to explain. There is no common language on shapes and styles. The International Committee of Latin Palaeography has been discussing this for nearly 70 years now, and in a sense doesn't have an answer. And part of the reason there is no simple answer was also mentioned yesterday, the fact of different points of view, and the fact that as soon as you impose a single terminology, a single vocabulary, by definition, in a sense, you are imposing a single point of view. And this, I think, is neither desirable nor helpful. And I think even the Committee of Latin Palaeography has recognized that this is a real problem. So when I'm talking about describing handwriting, I want to be very clear that I'm not saying we all should call an ascender an ascendant, we all should use exactly the same terminology. The problem and the real tension is we still need some common language. We need some common language to communicate between informatics and palaeography. We need some common language to communicate between palaeographers, not to mention as a Latin palaeographer talking to a Greek palaeographer, a Hebrew palaeographer talking to a Chinese palaeographer, this gets more and more difficult as we go. And yet, these are also important things to do, as we'll see shortly. So another point of view, more or less the same, again, coming from Latin palaeography, Armando Petrucci arguing, I think clearly that, again, each palaeographical terminology is connected to a particular historical vision, and these are all, at least in principle, valid. And so part of the challenge, again, is how can we even sustain these different points of view through in ways that we can communicate with each other. Now, just to give a little bit of background of what I'm doing at the moment, I'm quite heavily involved in the Scripta-PSL project, which is very useful and interesting for these sorts of questions. Because most of us, I think it's fair to say, are used to working in a more or less the same script system. So today we're talking about Greek and Coptic, which already I think we're going to hear more this morning, poses some challenges, but it's still more or less the same. Once we start talking again about Chinese and Hebrew and some of these other writing systems, then things get much more interesting in a sense and much more complicated. So this Scripta-PSL, part of the idea of what we're doing is to develop digital frameworks that can operate across, in principle, all the written artifacts in history. And when I say that, this is just a small selection of some of the languages and writing systems that we're talking about. So part of our challenge is it even possible or meaningful or useful to communicate between Middle Iranian and Old Vietnamese, for instance? Does this even make sense? On paper, it looks great. In practice, is this even possible? And again, is there a way of developing a framework, a way of describing writing that might be able to begin to address these sorts of questions? To give some examples of why it's useful, why it's very important, here is one we were talking about yesterday. Well, we weren't talking about, we were talking about this sort of context yesterday of things like learning and familiarity and bilingualism. What's going on here, the first 4 lines, this is written in England not long after the Norman conquest. The first 4 lines are in English, and the bottom half is all in Latin. And I imagine it's clear to everybody that the first 4 lines are written in a very irregular and problematic way. Clearly the scribe is not happy. And then in Latin, it sort of goes on. What does this tell us? Well, I think it's fairly clear. This tells us this is a Norman scribe who doesn't know English, is copying a bilingual document. So by being able to compare these sorts of details, we can draw interesting historical inferences about this sort of interoperability, if you like, between 2 different scribes. Of course, we can take this much further, right? We have these sorts of examples. Is this the same person writing Greek, Latin, and Hebrew? If we can answer that clearly, that tells us very interesting things about who's learning what, where, and when, the interaction between cultures, and so on. But how do we compare the Hebrew and the Greek, for instance, when they're written probably with different pens, different styles, different details? The Latin and the Hebrew is a little bit easier in this case, and in fact, the Hebrew at least probably was written by a Latin scribe. But again, these different interoperabilities, if you like, in the sense of communicating between each other. And we can go on. Here's the Chinese Hebrew that I mentioned. Is this Hebrew native scribe, so to speak, writing Chinese? Vice versa, are they 2 different people? How do we start to answer these questions? Now, maybe these are impossible questions. I accept that, but it seems they're interesting questions, nevertheless. And to do this, we need, again, a way of communicating clearly and convincingly, which I think we're still struggling with a bit. So to talk briefly about the archetype model, and Simona's going to talk more about archetype in general in the second paper after mine. But this was software developed 10 years ago or so now, at least started then. And part of the idea here was to complement the sorts of things that we were talking about yesterday. In other words, we have a number of people in this room, much better than I, at doing the very computational statistical approaches for comparing handwriting. It seems to me there is also need for more descriptive approaches. Things like, I think it was mentioned yesterday, one of the values of the script analyzer was not necessarily the results, but the process of working through and interacting with the material and so on. So this is part of the idea of archetype, is to provide that in addition to the other approaches that we've been talking about. How does it work? Well, the basic model is you have your character, which can have different allographs, and these are all designed by the experts in the field. So as an expert in 11th century script, Latin script, I say there is this thing which is a character H minuscule, and it has these 2 allographs. These allographs can have these components with wedges and so on and so forth. And another expert, Deborah Matos, for instance, an expert in Hebrew palaeography, she decided that for her it's more useful to talk about a square aleph with diagonal strokes and so on. So the principle, at least, is that we can incorporate different points of view in ways that are communicated in more or less clear and convincingly, while still operating within this common framework, which, at least in principle, might allow communication. So once you do this, you can, at least for the moment, draw your boxes by hand, and within your own descriptive labels, apply them. So here we decided this is an insular G with hangs from the middle and large, and so on and so forth. Again, we've discussed for a long time having more automated computational methods plugged in together. So far we haven't done that, but there's certainly interesting potential there. So I can say something like, it's no worries. So I can do things like search for, I'm interested in this particular scribe, show me examples of his letters, how the descenders were written. And if you look carefully, you can see in the bottom line, the descenders are very straight, in the upper lines, the descenders are all curved to the left. And also, the bottom line, the scribe is writing in Latin. The upper lines is writing in Old English. And so this is a way for me to communicate to you, I hope clearly and convincingly, that the scribe changed the way he wrote his descenders depending on the language. And because of the flexibility, and there's no need to train models or anything, we can apply it to Hebrew, for instance. Arabic, we experimented a little bit. Chinese, if it's not cursive, it works pretty well. Mayan, for instance. Now I have a student who's working on Old Khmer inscriptions. This is just a screenshot of the terminology. Again, it seems to translate relatively well. We'll hear more in a minute about applying to Greek inscriptions and other contexts. And going beyond that, other forms of visual communication. For instance, here are birds, treating birds in a sense like letters, and posing the question, were there, for instance, heads that were used as a template? Did they use the template for heads? By looking for heads of birds, we can compare them visually, or send them to a computational approach, deep learning, and so on and so forth. So that's where things stand, and to a large extent have stood for a while. For the remaining 10 minutes or so, I want to get into where next and where some of the problems and complications are. Going back, sort of bridging the gap a little bit, Donald Knuth, I think, very interestingly wrote about how we know from experience that we can understand an idea after we have taught it to somebody else. And the best way to understand something is to know it so well you can teach it to a computer. This, I think, is quite perceptive in a sense. A number of people, after using Archetype, a number of palaeographers have come back to me and said, actually now I can see questions and problems and understand things just by that process of going through and annotating, let alone the question of communicating and so forth. But it's also true, I think, that in developing this model and trying to communicate handwriting to a computer, it's thrown up a lot of problems which I at least hadn't necessarily seen beforehand. And this leads me back to something that, again, I've been saying for a while, that there's a real problem, I think, still around terminology in particular and an ontology, some sort of common framework, and in particular, well-defined entities with a unique meaning that we can all agree on. Again, this is not saying we should all describe things in the same way. It's saying much more basic things like, what is a letter? And when you start thinking about it, that question is not at all easy to answer. I'm afraid I'm going to go on for a little bit about this. I'll try and go through quickly, but it's mainly to pose the problem and to try to illustrate the point, if it's not clear, that even these very fundamental terms we're using all the time, I'm not sure certainly I don't know necessarily what they mean, at least formally enough to teach to a computer. So grapheme, and I imagine most people were taught something along the lines of the grapheme is the small, meaningful contrastive unit in a writing system. That looks fairly clear. For instance, brown and brown are the same word, right? Therefore, capital B and lowercase b are the same grapheme. Well, unfortunately not, right? It's brown as opposed to it's brown. Different context, different here. They're commutative, as they say. If you swap a lowercase and an uppercase b in this context, the meaning changes. Therefore, in this sense, they're not graphemes. We can go on if we go to Saussure, so in a sense, the father of this structuralist approach, and see what he said about the question. This is his response, that the way of producing a sign is irrelevant, essentially. Whether they're in black or white, or bas relief, written with a quill, chisel, is entirely irrelevant for their meaning. I assume no palaeographers would agree with that, because if so, we're out of a job in a sense, right? This is very much the opposite of what we do. And again, it's very easy to come up with many examples. I discovered this one last night, for instance, where clearly the use of black letter has very, very strong connotations in our society about nationalism and so on and so forth. So to say that the two letters there have the same meaning, yes, from a linguistic point of view, of course it makes sense, but on a larger point of view, it doesn't. And so there's a lot of discussion if you start looking about how to capture this, how to represent this. For instance, fact that it seems difficult to separate the form and the substance. And this and others have proposed things like you have different types of graphemes. You have the letter A, for instance, the sort of segmental, and then the suprasegmental, where you say, okay, there's A, but there's also the font or the style and so on, which in a sense transcends that. And then you have interference beyond the two and so on and so forth. So again, people trying to, but this definition of grapheme is a very different one from one that many other people are talking about. I mentioned interoperability and multilingualism and so on. And once we start going into that context, as I'm not sure if Simona will mention, but I know she's addressing as well, for instance, in a Greek or Coptic context, things start getting complicated again very quickly. Once you start looking at these examples, trying to define these entities in ways that stand up to very different contexts across the whole breadth of human experience and activity, things start getting very, very messy very, very quickly. I particularly like this one, actually. I think clearly, in fact, it is a letter M typographically, but they've rotated it to make it look like a Greek sigma, which is functioning in the form of a French E. What is that? How do you describe that in a meaningful way to a computer, let alone to anybody else? And of course, in medieval contexts, we have these sorts of things. I'm not sure how clear that is. This is from the Linus van Gospels. The way you read it is here you have a D, A, V, I, D, so David. Then this, obviously, is a Greek 5, but it's functioning as a Latin F, with presumably the I, another I over the top, so F-I-L-I-I, Filii Abraham, so David, son of Abraham. Again, what is that? Is it an F? Is it a phi? Is it an I on top? This polyvalence, if you like, starts complicating things an awful lot. And again, in a Latin context, you have things like this, where this symbol can mean all sorts of different things, but in this context, it's an abbreviation for the Latin name, Jesus Christ, using Latin letters which are functioning like the Greek letters that have more or less the same shape. In other words, in Greek, this would be an eta and a rho. Eta and rho in Greek look more or less like Latin H and P, and so they're used in this abbreviation. Again, how do you formally pin this down? It becomes very messy very quickly. So just to say, it's not just me who's aware of this, the smallest meaningful contrastive unit, but then, as Danielson Bright said, grapheme is intended usually to designate a unit of writing system, but in practice tends to be used for other things, like letter diacritic, character or sign. And even when we do understand it as the smallest functional unit, it's unclear in what sense these units are comparable, so we're back to the point of view. And this is before you start on things like abbreviations and ligatures and other elements as well. So there has been, I'm running out of time, so I'll move fairly quickly, but just to show some of the other interesting complications when you start getting into things like Mayan, where here you have the silvographic context function, but then you also have these deformations, which in a sense are the same graph, and in a sense not. And again, how do you try to capture these? So, it can go on with the different functions, the different representations, the reoccurrence, and almost always understanding this requires context, which is entirely missing from a lot of the definitions. And Bala Manella and others have talked about this as well, without really coming up with solutions, I think. So where does this leave us? Well, in a sense, it brings us back to the ontology, and this is partly what I'm arguing for. Again, the details of grapheme, in a sense, don't matter so much now. My point more is that if we want to communicate with each other, and I think we do, we have quite a lot of work still to do in terms of what it is that we're talking about. And this is part of the idea of this ontology. So there are some already. This gold one, it's a little bit old now, but it was used for linguistics. And partly for that reason, they have a little bit about writing, but very little. It wasn't their emphasis, and clearly it's not sufficient for our purposes. Idiom was the one I mentioned for the Mayan hieroglyphs, which is much more advanced and talks about function and so on, but still, I think they would agree there's still a lot that could be captured there. CIDOC-CRM is the big famous one, which has been adapted in part from manuscripts and a little bit for writing. So they talk about things like an inscription being a type of mark, which is an information object. Already we're sort of blurring things, the mark, the physical form, the information object is the content, and so on. But they've done a lot of work towards trying to specify these different details. So I've probably confused and maybe muddied the waters a lot, which in many ways is my goal. On the sense we need to be pragmatic, of course we do. And things like archetype and things like the things we were looking at yesterday, clearly they're very useful. I'm not at all suggesting they're not. And it's also true we can get bogged down for years in these very fine details. But I do think still that in addition to the very pragmatic approaches, we also need to be thinking about what we're talking about here. So again, a single descriptive vocabulary, no, I don't think that makes sense. But I still wonder how we can be clear about our assumptions, as we were saying yesterday, without more precise definitions. We can just about get away within a discipline, but once we start crossing between disciplines, things get much, much more complicated. So I think still we need an ontology for script. And I will stop there. Thank you.